More than 125 years ago, an American archaeologist neared the end of an epic 15-year solo expedition in which he single-handedly discovered, mapped, and recorded more than 10,000 prehistoric Indian mounds throughout the U.S. Midwest. His journey eventually brought him to Aurora in Kane County, Illinois. Along the eastern ridge of the Fox River, just north of the city of Aurora, he discovered and mapped more than 10 effigy mounds in the area which is now a field and cemetery behind us.
Please join us as we investigate the Lost Mounds of Aurora, as well as the epic journey of archaeologist Theodore Hayes Lewis. And if you're enjoying these videos, please like, subscribe, and share them. And leave us a comment. We really would love to hear from you.
The primary sources for this video include Effigy Mounds near Aurora, Illinois by Theodore Hayes Lewis.
The articles, The Hill-Lewis Archaeological Survey, and A Unique Survey by Charles Reuben Keyes.
Theodore H. Lewis, An Obituary by Fred A. Finney.
Period maps.
Period newspaper clippings.
And period census records and vital records. First discovered in the 1890s, the Lewis Mound site is today known to archaeologists as two contiguous mound group sites aligned north to south, with site K16 to the north and site K15 to the south. The K designates Kane County, while the number is a unique number assigned to the site within the county, typically in the order documented. These sites lie along a gently sloping ridge on the east side of the Fox River, bounded between Indian Trail Road to the south, Sullivan Road to the north, Illinois Route 25 to the west, and Aurora Lane to the east, in Aurora, in Kane County, Illinois. The mound groups consisted of a few clusters of effigy mounds. Effigy mounds meaning low-lying human-made earthworks, often made in the shape of animals, birds, mythical figures, or simple shapes, such as circles or ellipses. Today there appears to be no trace of these mounds, with most of the land area occupied by St. Joseph's Cemetery.
The land underlying the mound sites, as well as all of the land in the region, was once held by the indigenous Native American tribes that inhabited the area. In historic times, this was primarily the Potawatomi, although other tribes such as the Sauk and Fox were also in the area. In 1834, New York immigrant Joseph McCarty, hoping to exploit the Fox River via water-powered mills, staked a claim on the east bank of the Fox River, amidst the Big Wood, as it was called, an ancient grove of trees that encircled the area, and directly across the river from a large Potawatomi village, overseen by Chief Waubansie. Following the defeat of Chief Black Hawk by state militia in 1832, Chief Waubansie and his people, although friendly to the European settlers, were forced to retreat across the Mississippi River into Iowa Territory in 1837, laying the land fully open for settlement by Europeans.
In 1840, this land was formally surveyed by William Milburn, surveyor of the public lands in the states of Illinois and Missouri, using the Public Land Survey System, by which the land was divided up into townships, typically consisting of a 6x6 grid of sections, with each section being 1 square mile. Occasionally, however, this standard township size and shape varied, depending upon the topography of the land.
The range was determined by how far west or east it was from a predefined principal meridian, in this case the third principal meridian, a fixed imaginary line running north-south through the middle of Illinois, while the township number was determined by how far north or south it was of an imaginary fixed baseline, drawn east-west through southern Illinois. And so, using this public land survey system, the Lewis Mounds, consisting of archaeological sites K15 and K16, is located in Township 38 North, Range 8, east of the 3rd Principal Meridian, and in Section 10 of that township.
In 1843, Joseph, or Joe Stolp, obtained the land patent for the southwest corner of Section 10, which happened to include the two mound groups. Stolp, the son of German emigrants and a War of 1812 veteran, had been in the area since at least 1840, having earlier staked a claim. He had migrated to Illinois from New York in the mid-1830s, along with his wife, Margaret Marlett Stolp, and their 4 children. In the early days of settlement, Stolp is said to have hosted a few feasts for some of the remaining Native Americans in the area, having had cordial relations with them. Stolp lived and farmed this property until the late 1860s, at which point the land ownership transferred to Peter Miller, or Muller.
Miller was a recent emigrant from Germany, having arrived in the United States in 1865, along with his wife, Catherine, and their 3 sons. By 1871, Miller owned and farmed the property, which included the Effigy mound groups. Here, Miller and his wife raised their family until Peter's death as a result of pneumonia in 1887.
Just to the south of the Stolp-Muller property lay the expanding city of Aurora, Illinois. Aurora had its origins with McCarty's Mills, built in the mid-1830s, which grew into a settlement over time, as it was used as a stopover for the relentless stream of European settlers headed to the west. By the mid-1840s, the settlement to the east of the river had grown to a point at which it incorporated as a village, as East Aurora, the Aurora name likely coming from a town in upstate New York from which many of the early residents hailed. Less than a decade later, in 1854, the settlement to the west of the river incorporated as West Aurora, with much tension ensuing from the rivalry of the 2 young burgeoning towns. The competing villages ultimately merged together as the city of Aurora in 1857, in a negotiated peace whereby the new city's town center would be situated on Stolp Island in the Fox River, neutral territory midway between the 2 settlements. This Stolp Island was named for Joseph G. Stolp, a prominent early industrialist of Aurora and nephew of Joseph Stolp, the farmer and mound owner whom we had met earlier.
By 1890, the prosperous city of Aurora had grown to a population of nearly 20,000, one of the largest cities in Illinois. Entering into this busy and burgeoning landscape was itinerant archaeologist Theodore Hayes Lewis, recently of St. Paul, Minnesota, who was nearing the end of an enormous and ambitious project started more than a dozen years earlier. Lewis was in the Fox River Valley area to map and survey ancient earthworks and mounds as part of the Northwestern Archeological Survey, launched in 1880 by himself and colleague Alfred J. Hill.
Hill, born in England in 1833, and more than 20 years the senior of Lewis, developed an avid interest in history and archaeology while serving as a civil engineer for the U.S. government and the young state of Minnesota. He developed a reputation as being a tireless and exacting scholar. Hill became acquainted with the work of Lewis, who had been engaged in a Southern Archaeological Survey, which Lewis had started in 1878. Their mutual interest of surveying and mapping the disappearing ancient mounds of the U.S. Midwest before these earthworks fully vanished beneath the plow and the onslaught of civilization brought these 2 men of very different backgrounds together.
Theodore Hayes Lewis had an unsettled upbringing, which may explain his subsequent nomadic tendencies. He was born in Richmond, Virginia, around 1856, to Hiram Lewis and Marie Curdy. When he was very young, the Lewis family moved to Arkansas, where Theodore appears to have been at least partially raised by aunts and uncles. After finishing his public schooling there, he ventured to Ohio in 1874, where he enrolled in the Miami Commercial College in Dayton. Upon completion of his education, he then worked as a school teacher near Chillicothe, Ohio, where he learned the craft of surveying and the science of archaeology, after witnessing some of the early archaeological digs at the enormous Hopewell earthworks and mounds in the south-central Ohio area.
In 1876, at the age of 30, his newfound passion for archaeology sent him southward to Arkansas, Mississippi, and Tennessee, where he did archaeological work in proxy for a professor in Germany for a period of 2 years. Roused by this experience, Lewis then formed his own surveying company and launched an ambitious project, the Southern Archaeological Survey, typically undertaken in the winter months, where he surveyed and recorded thousands of Native American earthworks and mounds in Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas. This southern enterprise brought him to the attention of Alfred J. Hill, who, himself lacking in youthful vigor and stamina, saw in the much younger and intrepid Lewis a valuable archaeological collaborator, and enlisted him in a partnership that would constitute one of the last great epic anthropological expeditions to be undertaken in the United States.
Their project, the Northwestern Archeological Survey, was hugely ambitious: to survey, map, and record as many of the remaining ancient earthworks that yet existed in the upper Midwest of the U.S., including Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, and North and South Dakota, while Hill, who was funding the entire project, stayed behind in Minnesota to collate the results and make drawings of the study sites. Lewis set out alone, on foot, horseback, stagecoach, rowboat, steamboat, and railroad, covering an estimated 54,000 miles in total, with more than 10,000 miles on foot over the course of 15 years.
With every field season, from the spring of each year until the snow flew, the itinerant archaeologist journeyed from state to state, county to county, town to town, inquiring about, as well as searching for, any earthworks in the area, before setting out to find them and survey them. He was often at risk of his own safety, not only from the remaining wilderness and forces of nature, but from the threat of thieves and gangs of tramps, as they were called. Indeed, in a dispatch to Hill in 1893, Lewis wrote, "I have come within an ace of being held up several times. Yesterday we were surrounded at one time by a number of tramps, but a small rifle and a 7-shooter held them off. If things keep on the same line, I will be compelled to carry a revolver for self-protection. I do not like to carry anything of the kind." The following year, Lewis commented dryly in his writings, "Along the upper Mississippi, the river rats and tramps make the route dangerous. Along the upper Tennessee, the moonshiners are the curse to the country."
Surveying and surviving among such rough company, Lewis did not suffer fools gladly, and was no stranger to physical altercations, sometimes nursing injuries suffered during these melees. In his writings, Lewis makes multiple references to fights and altercations. Newspaper clippings also reveal that within a year of the launch of the Northwestern Archaeological Survey, Lewis was likely involved in a shooting at a St. Paul, Minnesota boarding house in a dispute over religious views. Through all of this 15-year adventure and peril, Lewis was paid by Hill at a rate of $3 for each day spent surveying and mapping, or the equivalent of $110 per day and a little less than $14 per hour in 2020 money.
Knowing that the Effigy Mound tradition was centered in Wisconsin, in 1893, Lewis set out to ascertain the southeasternmost reach of the Effigy Mound earthworks in northern Illinois and Indiana. In late August and early September of that year, Lewis's travels took him to Aurora in Kane County, Illinois. Along a terrace ridge on the east bank of the Fox River, on the gentle slopes of the Miller Farm, now part of the Peter Miller Estate, and in the southwest quarter of Section 10, Township 38, north of Range 8, east, Theodore Lewis found, surveyed, and recorded 2 groups of effigy mounds. Lewis believed these mounds to be the most southeasterly of those known or recorded for the effigy mound tradition. And so a few months later, Lewis described the Aurora Mound's discovery in a 4.5-page article entitled Effigy Mounds Near Aurora, Illinois, published in the March 1894 edition of the Archaeologist periodical.
Lewis recorded that the northernmost group consisted of 2 bird effigy mounds and 3 conical mounds. One of the bird effigies was about 35 feet long by 35 feet wide and was about 1.5 feet high. The second bird effigy Lewis referred to as an owl, with horns or feathers that protruded from the head. This larger effigy was about 50 feet long and 2 feet in height.
The second group of mounds was located about 450 feet to the south, on the same terrace, and included 2 bird effigies, 1 elliptical mound and 13 round mounds, of which Lewis only surveyed and recorded those that had not been defaced, either by plowing or removal of soils. The single mapped bird effigy in this mound group was about 1.5 feet high, with a wingspan of 36 feet, and was 32 feet in length, from head to tail.
Within several years of Lewis' visit to the mound site, St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Aurora had acquired a portion of the Miller property to be used as a cemetery for their newly established church, located just a mile south-southwest on High Street in Aurora, Illinois. The church also acquired the 5-acre open field triangle parcel to the south of the cemetery. The 9-acre parcel to the north of the cemetery is today owned by MJW Aurora Properties and is used for storage of truck trailers and shipping containers.
But can we trust Lewis's designation of these earthworks as being human-made and effigy mounds? Our response would be yes. Lewis was known during his lifetime for his accurate surveying and the integrity of his descriptions, as well as his deep experience and expertise regarding U.S. Midwest Indian mounds. Modern archaeologists have followed up with many of his mound mappings and descriptions, and for those that have not been obliterated by development and farming, his track record is strong.
Given that he recorded well over 12,000 earthworks during the Northwestern Archeological Survey, one might be tempted to suggest that he saw mounds that perhaps did not exist. However, Lewis often rejected possible mounds brought to his attention. In his 1894 article, he mentions rejecting the mound claims of multiple localities in the lower portion of the state of Michigan upon his personal examination. Newspaper articles also describe his examining and rejecting mounds in South Dakota, favoring their origins to be geologic rather than human-made. And so it is clear that Lewis was a discerning archaeological investigator.
Furthermore, we know from local histories that Aurora did indeed have human-made ancient earthworks in the vicinity of the city. For example, a 1908 history states, "But they, the Native Americans, left the graves of their ancestors behind, and several mounds in Aurora and vicinity are known as Indian burying grounds." Later, the same book indicates that another Indian graveyard had previously been situated at what is today Calvary Cemetery in Aurora. In fact, when European settlers first arrived in the area, there were dozens of ancient Native American mound groups lining both sides of the Fox River, from Dundee to Aurora.
But after 125 years, is it still possible to accurately place the Lewis effigy mound groups on a modern map? Can we find their original location after all of the plowing and ground disturbance that has taken place in the past 100 years? In his published article, Lewis, known for his accurate surveying, provides several clues for their placement. First, he notes that the northern group is in the northeast quarter of the southwest quarter of Section 10, while the southern group is in the southeast quarter of the southwest quarter of Section 10. This is an important point, as we'll see. The 2 mound groups were also noted as being about 450 feet apart, oriented roughly north-south, situated upon the same terrace on a ridge along the east bank of the Fox River. His drawing of the entire site indicates that the mound groups were approximately 450 feet from the Fox River's water's edge, although the river banks have likely shifted somewhat in the past 100 years, due to both natural and human-made factors.
If we look at a modern map, we can first mark out the section information, as Lewis mapped the mound to Section 10 of Township 38 North, which is Aurora Township in Kane County. Then we divide Section 10 into quarters, as both mound groups were described as being located in the southwest quarter. Then we divide the southwest quarter itself into quarters, as Lewis denoted the 2 mound groups as being in different quarters of the southwest quarter. Finally, we scale Lewis's site drawing to approximately match the modern map and orient it so as to approximately align with the Fox River bank.
We can see by positioning Lewis's drawing over the modern map that the two mound groups can be in a range of possible positions north to south, while still satisfying the condition that the mound groups are in two different quarters of the southwest quarter of Section 10. Although the drawing does not enable us to firmly fix the position, it does allow us to significantly narrow down where the mound groups were originally positioned along Illinois Route 25.
We can make multiple observations from this initial mapping. First, the site placement on the modern map indicates that the mound groups would have been fairly close to Illinois Route 25, no more than 150 feet to the east of the road, and likely much closer. It is possible, though far less likely, that the mound groups were located to the west of Illinois Route 25. We say less likely as the land to the west of the road has a steeper grade, dropping down towards the river, compared to the gently sloping land to the east of the road, more in line with Lewis's description of the topography. It's also possible that at least a portion of the mounds group disappeared beneath a widened Illinois Route 25, a road which was indeed in existence when Lewis visited in 1893.
Second, the possible range of locations for the northern mound group would have been along the northwest corner of St. Joseph's Cemetery to within 100 feet north of the cemetery's Illinois Route 25 entrance. Note that the northern mound group would therefore have been wholly contained in the area bounded by St. Joseph's Cemetery, and would almost certainly have been defaced and obliterated since Lewis's 1893 visit, as the grave sites all along the western edge of the cemetery would have greatly disturbed any former earthworks.
Third, the possible range of locations for the southern mound group would have been from just south of the Illinois Route 25 cemetery entrance to approximately 220 feet south of the cemetery fence line, in the triangular open field to the south of the cemetery. As such, there is a chance that some of these South Mound Group earthworks have survived to the present day, especially as this field does not appear to have been greatly disturbed or developed since the Lewis visit.
Fourth, based on Lewis's description of the earthworks, neither of the mound groups would have been wholly or partially contained in the parcel of land to the north of St. Joseph's Cemetery, which is today used as a storage container facility.
Are there other ways to potentially see the Lewis mound groups, such as topographical maps? Earlier topographical survey maps from the U.S. Geological Survey do not provide sufficient resolution to identify mounds or earthworks that may have been only a few feet in height, as the contour lines were typically drawn to a resolution of 10-foot gradations. However, modern topographical maps are drawn with greater resolution, to within 2-foot gradations. But even with this finer granularity, the mound earthworks that Lewis saw almost 130 years ago do not stand out from these maps.
Aerial photographs, however, do provide some additional information. For example, the 1939 aerial photo of the area tells us that the field to the south of the cemetery remained open, with little or no development or major disturbance. This photo also suggests that, at least at that time, there was no active cultivation of this field.
Also, by enhancing the contrast of this 1939 photo, we can attempt to visualize any earthworks that might stand out, especially as this was only a little more than 45 years subsequent to the Lewis visit. Since the northern mound group was obliterated by modern grave sites, we'll focus our attention on the southern mound group. And with an eye of faith, one can make out variations that suggest earthworks, circles, linears, and other shapes, although nothing that necessarily aligns with the Lewis mound group drawing. Enhancements of more recent aerial photos, although of greater resolution than the 1939 photos, also require some degree of imagination to see any patterns that resemble the 1894 Lewis description. Based on these observations, it's safe to say that at best case, only remnants of the Lewis mounds might still remain, although indiscernible to the naked eye, and only of the southern mound group.
The Northwestern Archeological Survey came to an abrupt end just a year after Lewis's article describing the Aurora Mounds, upon the death of Alfred J. Hill in 1895. Not only did Lewis lose a longtime trusted colleague and partner in this endeavor, but also the project's funding agent. Lewis had been led to believe that Hill had set up an endowment for their survey's long-term funding via his last will and testament. But Hill's will never materialized, and Hill's estate instead went to his remaining relatives in England. The vast accumulated drawings and descriptions of the Northwestern Archaeological Survey, describing well over 12,000 Midwestern tumuli and earthworks, being technically part of the Hill estate, were kept indefinitely in storage, and out of the hands of the man who had recorded all of them, Theodore H. Lewis.
In 1898, Lewis, who worried that the survey documents would end up moldering in the attic of an English country home, used his own notes and recollections to publish a brief 16-page summary of the Northwestern Archaeological Survey, describing its mission, costs, deficiencies, and general results. Several years later, in 1905, Jacob Brandenburg Brouwer of the Minnesota Historical Society recognized the importance of the Hill-Lewis survey and convinced the Minnesota State Legislature to purchase the Northwest Archaeological Survey archives from the likely oblivion of the Hill estate for $3,900, which translates to about $120,000 in 2020 money.
With the epic Northwest Archaeological Survey behind him, Lewis's life remained unsettled. He briefly entered the publishing business in St. Paul, Minnesota, the city where he had previously shared quarters with Alfred Hill for several years. During this time, he authored and edited a few scholarly works, mostly centered on the expeditions of Hernando de Soto through Florida and the southeastern United States. And perhaps embittered by the whole Hill-Will fiasco, he seems to have left Minnesota at about the very time that the Minnesota Historical Society had reacquired the Northwest Archaeological Survey records. In the 1910s, he is next reported wandering through Colorado, researching and surveying some of the ancient Native American mounds found there. By 1920, now in his 60s, Lewis appears to have moved in with relatives in St. Louis, Missouri, while owning and operating a corner newspaper stand. In his final years, the 1930 U.S. Census finds Lewis living in the St. Louis Infirmary, the public institution that housed the poor and insane of St. Louis.
While Lewis had wandered in the first part of the 20th century, scholars had slowly begun to rediscover the rich trove of documents and field notes of the Northwestern Archaeological Survey, still held by the Minnesota Historical Society. They marveled at the survey's expansive scope, exquisite drawings, and detailed descriptions, and published articles praising its achievements. Newspapers, too, picked up on this renewed interest and waxed prosaic on the adventures of the Hill-Lewis expedition, at the very time when Theodore Hayes Lewis's life precipitously waned in the St. Louis Infirmary. Lewis passed away on July 17, 1930, as a result of chronic myocarditis. He was buried in a potter's field, just a half-mile to the southwest of the St. Louis Infirmary. No monument marked his life in passing, and no earthwork signaled his achievements.
The Lewis Mounds would have been like other effigy mounds found primarily to the north and west, in Wisconsin and Iowa, generally low-lying earthen mounds in the form of animals, birds, or simple conical shapes, containing few or no burials, and what burials were deposited were typically bundle burials or cremation remains, containing few or no artifacts. Indeed, the mound itself was the artifact, the cultural expression of the indigenous community, perhaps a place of ritual or mortuary practice, or community gatherings, or all of the above. These community earthworks would very likely have been created in the late woodland era, approximately 1,000 years ago. As most of these sacred places have been lost to us, and the people that created them are long gone, they can only speak to us in the most basic of terms, as special sacred landscapes that had significance and meaning to the local communities and tribes. It is both ironic and fitting, then, that the Lewis Mound site returned to being a sacred place, a place of remembrance, when the Stolp Miller farm, after decades of agricultural use, was converted to a cemetery in the early 1900s.
Since their discovery, archaeologists have revisited and re-examined the Lewis Mound site on at least a few occasions in the past 35 years. Thomas Bears of the Illinois Transportation Archaeological Research Program, ITARP, visited in 1988, and Phil Milhouse of the Illinois State Archaeological Survey examined the site in 2009. For both visits, no artifacts were found, nor were they able to discern any remaining earthworks at the site. Milhouse, however, was able to more accurately locate the site in the terrain than had been previously established. The visiting archaeologist concluded that over the course of the past 100 years of development and disturbance, the site had been essentially destroyed.
As such, we are indeed fortunate that Theodore Hayes Lewis happened to journey through Aurora, Kane County, Illinois in 1893 as part of the Northwestern Archeological Survey to faithfully record at least a few of the subtle ancient Native American earthworks that yet grace the terraces along the Fox River Valley, before yielding up to the plow, the backhoe, and to general neglect. Lewis and Hill's epic adventure should be remembered for not only greatly expanding our knowledge of the vast expanse of ancient Native American earthworks in the U.S. Midwest, but also for fulfilling our collective social obligation of recording significant cultural items in the landscape before they are lost to progress and time.
As always, thank you for watching. And if you're so inclined, please like, subscribe, and share. And we'll see you, in a manner of speaking, in our next video adventure.